We are investing 7 times the amount the Tories were.
Politicians keep talking about what they're going to spend, as though it's their money.
Britain will be investing twice as much in our school children, 3 times as much in the NHS.
Help with heating bills, insulation, social tariffs.
1 million pensioners' homes insulated.
They haven't got any of their own money.
Doubling of the science budget.
Paid holidays for all workers.
The government doesn't have any money of its own.
Spending
money.
More. Spending free museum entry.
They've got our money.
It's not their money.
Today in Britain, the government spends more than all private individuals and companies put together.
They spent like there was no tomorrow.
350,000, 1 million.
1 million.
34 million.
You spend like that, eventually there won't be.
The last government tested to destruction the idea that more spending was the answer.
Today in Britain, the public sector is bigger than the private sector.
Thank you.
It's absolutely enormous, the size of the state now.
I've got £90,000 in my pyjamas.
George Osborne says his cuts will save Britain.
We will make sure that the financial catastrophe that happened under the previous government never ever happens again.
Nothing quite as wonderful as money.
But in the next 5 years, annual government spending will climb from £697 billion to £757 billion.
There are areas where more public money could usefully be spent.
What the government describe as a cut are not what you and I would normally think of as a cut.
More money, increases in spending is not going to be enough.
During all that time, we will be adding to the total indebtedness of the country.
The cuts are too little, too late. We now have a national debt of £4.8 trillion.
The figures involved are mind-blowing.
That's £77,000 for every man, woman and child in the United Kingdom. The government is borrowing money from people who haven't even been born yet.
As much as children depend on us today, we are going to depend on them for far longer.
You can easily get into a situation in which the indebtedness of the country is growing exponentially and uncontrollably.
That's the kind of spiral that leads to national ruin.
How did Britain end up on the verge of bankruptcy? How did we accumulate such gigantic debts? And how will we ever pay them back?
Nobody's realised the scale of it, the arithmetic of it.
My name is Martin Durkin. I'm going to show you how Britain got into this mess, and I'm going to tell you what I believe is the only way out. This story is about the growth of Britain's public sector.
Are you a consultation and communities engagement manager?
It's about the myth that state spending can stimulate real economic growth.
The government's always talking about putting more money into the economy, stimulating the economy with more money. But where does that money come from? The answer is that it comes from the rest of us.
It's about the devastating effects of big government spending on the real economy.
You have to remember that when the government creates a job by taxing more, it's destroying jobs elsewhere by the act of taxation.
This film exposes the absurd idea that state monopolies are the best way to deliver good services.
The state knows that monopoly is a bad idea. At exactly the same time, it insists on monopolies in education and health.
And it shows that far from combating poverty, state spending on a vast scale actually creates the most dreadful poverty.
If you're working on a fairly lowish wage, let's say £8,000, £9,000, £10,000 a year, you are still being clobbered for taxation.
The Robin Hood state is simply a myth that's used to justify punitive levels of taxation.
And I go to Hong Kong to look at an alternative path for Britain, to see how shrinking the state has transformed the fortunes of Asia.
The lesson for nowadays government to learn is to learn the humility in front of the people. To learn that it's the people who create wealth, given the freedom.
Britain's national debt amounts to £4.8 trillion. Is that a lot of money?
It is gigantic. I think the law of large numbers means it's almost too big for people to even imagine. And as you know, there's a difference between the debt
in the city, this is a lot of money.
It's a lot of money. In fact, I don't even know what happens after trillion. So You know, maybe that'll be the next evolution. Just a lot of money.
Nobody's realised the scale of it, the arithmetic of it. We've failed, if you like, as a nation. Expert economists haven't drawn the matter sufficiently to the attention of the political class.
Are you concerned about the levels of debt?
I am very. It's so much beyond anything that I ever worked with when I was Chancellor of the Exchequer. Tiny figures have been exploded far beyond my understanding.
The figures involved are mind-blowing.
The real cost of bailing out the banks was trivial. It's estimated to have added a mere £73 billion to our debt, and the government may even make a profit when it sells back its bank shares. Trivial, at least, compared to our total debt of £4.8 trillion.
Now, 4.8 trillion is a very big number. It's hard to visualise that much money, but that's where the power of television comes in. Just suppose you counted out all that national debt in £50 notes. How high would your stack of 50s be? Bear in mind that a £50 note is very thin. It's officially just 0.11 of a millimetre. That means to get a stack just 1 millimetre high, you need almost £500.
According to the government, our national debt is around £1 trillion. But that figure does not include other hidden debts, like the government's gigantic pension liabilities. The government is relying on future generations to pick up the tab for the public sector and state pensions of people working today. When these hidden liabilities are added, government debt rises to £4.8 trillion. The British government has been spending money it didn't have, year after year, on a truly spectacular scale. Counted out in £50 notes, our national debt would form a stack no less than 6,500 miles high. Or to put it another way, if we sold all the houses and flats in the whole of the UK, we would still be the best part of £1 trillion short of paying back our debt. We decided to ask a random group of MPs about the enormous size of the debt. Here are some of their responses.
When it comes to the national debt, can you tell me what the rough figure is, sort of very, very roughly?
Well, I'm afraid I don't have that information.
Can you tell us what the official national debt is?
I don't have a figure for the official national debt.
Could you tell me very roughly, what the current national debt is? Is it 10 billion, 50 billion, 100 billion, very roughly?
No, I couldn't, but it changes virtually every week.
Billions or trillions?
We're talking trillions, but I mean trillions and billions really isn't what you need to explain to the public.
At the moment, for last year, it was about £156 billion.
It's 155 billion.
Something like £170 billion.
Don't you think it's important that MPs do know what the debt is?
Well, I go in and I take the debates very seriously. I listen to everything that's said.
Just explain what the difference is between budget deficit and national debt.
Well, I will leave that to economists to explain.
A common mistake among our MPs was to confuse the budget deficit, that's how much extra debt we're taking on each year, with the national debt. That's a very big mistake indeed. To illustrate how big, I'm running myself a bath.
So here we have the national debt in my bath, and here we have the budget deficit, the new debt that we're taking on coming out of the tax. And here we have George Osborne's cuts. He's using an egg cup. As you can see, although we are making cuts, we're still taking on far more debt than we are taking out in cuts. The level of the debt is continuing to rise. Despite the cuts, we're getting more and more in debt.
The government says it's cutting public spending, but actually most of those cuts are just cuts in projected increases. So in 5 or 6 years' time, public spending will actually be higher than it is currently and not very different in real terms after adjusting for inflation.
But during all that time, we will be adding to the total indebtedness of the country.
Britain's debt is gigantic and is getting bigger all the time. Some believe this isn't just insane, it's also deeply immoral.
The scales of debt and deficit are so huge that, in effect, the government is borrowing money from people who haven't even been born yet in order to pay for your and my lifestyles as we speak. That can't be right, can it?
It's a complete fraud, it's a complete theft. You are paying today's beneficiaries, you're paying yourself out of our children's and grandchildren's money.
The only reason they get away with it is because the unborn don't vote.
The immorality of this is breathtaking.
For years, public spending has been spiraling out of control. Last year, the government spent more on welfare payments alone than it raised in income tax. The resulting debts are so huge, it could take several decades to pay them off.
The money that the government is spending today is our money.
Would our children and grandchildren be happy in 2050 still to be paying for a massive splurge in public spending which took place in 2010? If they only knew what was coming their way, what would they say?
We're going to be paying this off for years and years. What's a trillion? I didn't know the numbers went that high. I don't even get pocket money.
Most of us care a lot about our children and grandchildren. We would do anything for them. We want them to be better off and lead fuller lives than we did. The idea of sponging off them or stealing their money upsets us. But that is exactly what politicians have been doing in our name.
Instead of leaving our children and our grandchildren with a better world, it's saddling them with debts that are on a breathtaking scale and in effect condemning them to a life of slavery.
Now, when an individual or a company borrows money, they have to repay it themselves. But when a politician borrows money, it's completely different. The politician doesn't have to pay it back. The people who voted for the politician don't have to pay it back. It must be repaid by people who have had no say whatsoever in the transaction. Is that borrowing or stealing?
What do we want? When do we want it? Why do we have to pay?
All those people whining about cuts have to ask themselves, is it right to expect our children and grandchildren still to be paying for our profligacy in 20 or 30 years' time? I mean, how much of their money do we think it's okay to spend?
But as recent events in Europe have shown, the staggering size of our debt isn't just morally wrong, it's also dangerous and could quite easily tip Britain into chaos. For years now, the British government has been living beyond our means on an astronomical scale.
Hello, what's your name?
Elsha.
Hi, my name's Martin.
Hi, Martin.
Hi. Do you see that behind us, that big clock?
48 trillion billion in debt.
I've no idea. Hang on. 400. It sounds like 4,800,000 and something.
I wonder if you can tell me what that number is. I wonder if it's a very big one.
4 million? No, 4,800,000. No, God, I don't know.
Shall I tell you?
Yeah.
It's £4.8 trillion. Pounds.
My goodness.
Does that worry you at all?
Yes,
we have a national.
It certainly does.
Do you think we're likely to pay it back very quickly?
No, not at all. I don't see any prospect of us paying it back at all in the near future. It's going to take generations to pay that back.
Despite the fuss about George Osborne's cuts, public spending in 5 years will be more or less the same as it is today, and our national debt will be even bigger. According to city commentators like Alistair Heath, the markets are worried not just about whether we can repay our national debt, but about whether we can sustain it.
Not only is the national debt very, very large at the moment, but that means obviously that the interest payment on that debt is eye-wateringly massive.
Soon we're going to be paying more interest on the government's debt than we do on all the nation's mortgages put together.
This is not like a fixed-term mortgage. Interest rates can go up.
Once interest rates start to go up, and they will, and they have to, and this is the lowest they've been in hundreds of years, then that puts the government in a very difficult situation.
Our payments would go up, and therefore the people lending us money, the financial markets and pension funds from all over the world, will start to worry that we can't actually pay this money back, so they will charge us an even higher interest rate.
Then you get into a very, very dangerous spiral, because people will always want more when they know that you're willing to pay more.
You can easily get into a situation in which the indebtedness of the country is growing exponentially and uncontrollably.
That's the kind of spiral that leads to national ruin.
As the Greek government discovered, when a country runs out of money to pay policemen and teachers and the army, it descends into chaos. The Greek economy is tiny compared to ours, and yet the EU struggled to save it. If the UK fails, what then?
The absolute nightmare scenario is that the government prints its way out of the problem. It just prints money like crazy.
And governments do it when they're in an awful lot of debt.
It's the worst thing you could do.
As the debt gets to be bigger and bigger, it becomes more than a temptation, it becomes a necessity. The governments get in a position where they can't do anything but inflate the currency.
More money is usually good when the money is worth something. Right? The more you print it, the less it's worth, and that's a problem for people.
British governments have been steadily debasing the currency, or printing money, for decades through the deliberate expansion of credit. Here is the money supply going up, and here is the spending power of sterling going down. When you go into a shop and everything seems more expensive, it's because the currency in your pocket is worth less and less. It was this easy credit policy that led to the recent financial crisis, because it rewards borrowing and punishes saving.
So if you're a saver, you're putting money aside in the bank in order to pay for your retirement. When your retirement comes, you find it's worth an awful lot less than you originally thought. Who's had the benefit of that? Not the bank, no, the government.
If money is losing its value, it's not a very good idea to save it. What you want to do is get out of it. So typically, in this period since 1971, it's been crazy to save money.
Now they're printing money even faster. They call it quantitative easing, and it's the ultimate stealth tax. If you'd put £100 in the bank last year, in effect it's now only worth £95. Many regard printing money as plain fraud.
People are cheated and defrauded by this.
So effectively they're stealing from people by printing money?
Oh, inflation is theft. There's no question about it at all.
You get a dollar printed up by the government right out off of the mint, and you look at it and you think, well, that's as good as any other dollar. But if it's an extra dollar, a dollar added to the money supply, it's counterfeit. There are no extra resources behind it.
Printing money is also a very dangerous thing to do.
I know it's hard for people to imagine, but in Germany, people used to go around with wheelbarrows full of money because the money wasn't worth actually the paper it was printed on.
Not many of us can remember back to the problems in the Weimar Republic and Austria in the 1920s. But there's a book about that called When Money Dies. The title's very good. And when money dies like that as a result of inflation, the whole economic structure dies.
Britain faces economic ruin. It is possible to escape the current crisis, but to do so, we must understand how we got into it. For years, politicians have been spending money they didn't have and saddling future generations with gigantic debts. Why do they do it?
Hello, everybody.
Well, part of the problem is it's very much in the interest of politicians to spend money.
What are you doing, Mr. Punch? I'm standing for election. Vote for me. Vote for me. Why should we vote for you? We think you're rubbish. That's not the way to win an election. I'm very sorry. I should think you are sorry.
To win votes, politicians often make grand promises. Promises that involve spending money.
I can have a brand new contemporary art gallery. Hold on, Mr. Punch. Where is all this money coming from? Oh,
Politicians want to be popular, so they buy the support of different groups by spending money. A dollop here, a dollop there. But the money they're spending isn't theirs. They're being generous with your money.
Politicians keep talking about what they're going to spend, as though it's their money. They haven't got any of their own money. They've got our money.
The government doesn't have any money of its own. All the money the government has is money that it is taken either in the form of borrowing or more probably taxation from other people. So elections have been described as bribing the voters with their own money.
It's not their money. If it was their money, they wouldn't spend it like that at all. They wouldn't be half as profligate.
At first, this money came from tax. But politicians found they couldn't raise enough from taxes and decided to borrow money. In effect, they were taxing future generations.
Hey, did somebody call for me? Yes. Can I have some money? How much would you like? 4.8 trillion pounds. 4.8 trillion pounds? And how are you going to pay that back? I know. Who is? The little baby. The little baby? Oh, dear. What have you done with my little baby? Mr. Punch is using it to borrow money. Naughty Mr. Punch. Oh, dear.
Over the past 100 years, as governments have taxed more and spent more, the state has grown bigger and bigger. The two world wars saw huge increases in government spending, and after each war, the state failed to shrink back to its former size. Today, we have reached a point where the public sector in Britain is bigger than the private sector. The expanded state sector is paid for out of taxes. The trouble is, to raise more tax, the government needs more people in jobs that actually pay tax.
Now you might ask, if we need more people with jobs, why doesn't the government just go out and hire loads more social workers and lollipop ladies and local government liaison officers? Sadly, that won't help. In fact, it'll push us even further into debt. That's because, for the most part, public sector workers don't create wealth, they consume it. It's the private sector that creates wealth, which the government then taxes. Private sector workers are tax producers. Public sector workers are paid for out of these taxes. They are tax consumers. Having too many tax consumers and not enough tax producers is precisely what has caused Britain to decline and caused this horrendous debt crisis. Not enough coming in, too much going out.
The public sector job has to be paid for by the public and out of tax revenue or borrowing money. And it isn't the same way as creating a genuine wealth-creating job.
Lollipop ladies are good, but actually they don't create any wealth. Social workers are good, they don't create any wealth. Firemen are good, but they don't create any wealth. At the end of it all, we actually need to manufacture something.
Taking money out of the private sector where wealth is created in order to divert it to the public sector where wealth is consumed is a very, very bad idea.
So to pay for more public sector workers, tax must be imposed on wealth-creating private sector workers. The trouble is, this raises the cost of labour.
As any well-to-do middle-class type will tell you, when they hire a nanny or a cleaner, they'd much rather not pay their tax. Why? Because it makes them more expensive to hire. From an employer's perspective, income tax is, in effect, a tax on labour. And just as a tax on cigarettes makes cigarettes more expensive, and a tax on alcohol makes alcohol more expensive, so a tax on labour does exactly the same.
Taxes discourage demand for whatever is being taxed. So if you've got very large taxes on labour, on wages, national insurance and so on, that would discourage the demand for labour. And that's a key reason why jobs are not being created in large enough numbers in the UK in the private sector.
You have to remember that when the government creates a job by taxing more, it's destroying jobs elsewhere by the act of taxation.
If there's another country, perhaps on the other side of the world, where they don't have such high taxes, that gives companies in that country a substantial advantage. They can actually turn around products more cheaply, more businesses become profitable, and the British businesses, which have these crushing burdens upon them, actually just become unsustainable, see their profits drop, or even go out of business altogether.
For every job that you create in the public sector, you destroy at least one job in the private sector.
The expanding state has changed the shape of Britain. Back in the 1960s, we had 8 million people working in manufacturing, and we had 3.5 million people working in the public sector. Today, the number of people working directly for government has risen to about 5.5 million. And when we add other people on the public payroll, like GPs, the figure rises to almost 7.5 million. The number of people working in manufacturing, meanwhile, has shrunk to less than 3 million. We are sometimes told that the loss of manufacturing jobs has been compensated by more service sector jobs. People like hairdressers, window cleaners and estate agents. But there is a problem with service sector jobs. Many of the things we want to buy are manufactured outside Britain. To pay for them, we need to sell things abroad. And most service sector jobs don't travel.
Well, the problem is it's very hard to export services. You can't very well shine somebody's shoes or do somebody's laundry unless they live near you. So typically you export product.
What's more, many of the new service sector workers are in regions which are largely supported by public money. They are what economists call secondary tax consumers.
You've got hundreds of thousands of jobs at the moment in Britain that derive all their revenues really from the public sector. They are hidden public sector jobs, which means the real size of the state sector when it comes to employment is even larger than we think at the moment.
Politicians sometimes say we shouldn't worry about a big public sector because public spending stimulates economic growth. Let's see if it's true. The trouble is, as we have seen, the government's only source of money is us. The taxman is visiting Roger the restaurant owner and taxing him £50. The £50 comes directly out of Roger's profits. Roger's £50 is then given in wages to a government employee. As it happens, this public servant feels like treating himself to a lavish French meal and graciously decides to patronise Roger's establishment. The bill comes to £50, which, given the cost of fish and foie gras these days, our public servant considers very reasonable. The government has returned every penny of Roger's tax to him in new business. But how stimulating does he find this? Roger's business is not more profitable, but less. In the end, he'll have no more money in the till than when he started, but now he's had to pay for extra food and wine and the chef's time. Government spending has left him not richer, but poorer.
The government's always talking about putting more money into the economy, stimulating the economy with more money. But where does that money come from? The answer is that it comes from the rest of us.
All of the government's money has to come from the private sector. That's what generates wealth. That's the only thing that there is to tax. There isn't any sort of magic pot of gold in the back garden at number 10 Downing Street.
I decided to run this past some of Britain's most powerful and enthusiastic supporters of state spending, starting with the head of the TUC, Brendan Barber.
But you're taking money out of the productive economy, and then you say you spend a little money of that money back in the productive economy. How is that stimulating?
Well, if we'd not seen the extra spending from government in the face of recession, I think the recession would have been very much worse. We'd have seen unemployment go higher.
But the extra spending comes from the productive economy, doesn't it?
Oh, well, of course.
The construction industry in this country would be on its knees if it wasn't for public sector works at the moment, because there's precious little private sector investment.
But aren't they just secondary tax consumers? I mean, I think the point that people find confusing is that governments talk as if they've got an independent source of money, when in fact it's our money. What you're saying is you can better spend our money than we can.
The only source of money that the public sector has is basically through taxes, one way or another.
The government doesn't have its own money, does it?
No, of course. I mean, the government is responsible for managing the public finances, and those public finances come from tax revenues.
Let's take another example. The government decides to build a shiny new office building and another 90,000 road humps. To do this, they employ private firms. The trouble is, the money to pay for it, and more, comes from tax levied on other sections of the productive economy.
The idea that the government of the day actually creates growth, creates prosperity, is the reverse of the truth.
You can clearly point at something the government's done. we've given you this job, or we've built that building. But if you're taking that money, I would say, out of the economy, out of the private economy, because you're taxing people's income or taxing products or taxing corporations, that's money that those individuals, that those shopkeepers, that those corporations don't have to build their own buildings.
Trying to stimulate the productive economy with public spending, paid for with money taken out of the productive economy, is like treating a patient by extracting blood out of one arm, spilling a great deal of it, and then injecting what's left into the other arm. The idea that public spending will stimulate growth is the biggest myth of the 20th century, and it's the cause of Britain's economic decline. The burden of paying for the public sector rests entirely on the private sector. A bigger public sector means higher taxes, and higher taxes means lower profits. We've reached the point now where Britain's supersized state is actually bigger than the private sector that supports it. The government spends more than all private individuals and companies put together. In some regions, a lot more. It is estimated that the state now accounts for more than 60% of the economy in Scotland. In the North East, it's 73%. In Wales, it's 77%. And in Northern Ireland, the state accounts for a staggering 81% of the economy.
When you've got a 70% of GDP public sector, that's worse even than what you had in a lot of Eastern European countries in the 1980s, when these countries were officially communist.
Once the state gets to the sort of size it is at the moment, of spending over 50% of national income, it becomes very difficult to reduce it.
One of the problems with government when it gets very large is that there's a vast number of interest groups who are feeding from the public trough.
The more people there are who owe their living to the state, then the more electors there are who are going to vote for an even larger state.
The vested interests that live off a state can become a majority of the electorate. And we're very close to that situation now.
So what's it like in those old manufacturing regions of Britain that now survive on vast quantities of public money? I've decided to go home to the northeast, where I grew up. Anyone who believes that huge amounts of public spending will stimulate economic growth should come here. The northeast burst into life with the Industrial Revolution. It started with coal, but to bring up the coal and send it on its way required other stuff. Iron and timber, docks and cranes, rope making and shipbuilding, and newfangled railways. I'm playing guide to author and expert in economic geography, Dr. Richard Wellings.
What do you think of all this? Well, it's a shame that these sort of great old commercial buildings have now been sort of put to pretty low-grade uses.
The little businesses that are in there, you can't imagine them actually being able to build the buildings that they're occupying.
No, that's right. It's from a tremendous boom time for Newcastle.
I mean, just the number of fantastic buildings that were going up within 10, 20 years.
That's right.
That one you think is probably late 18th century, but most of the others, you're talking kind of middle part of the 19th century for the most part.
Yes, in those days, of course, the state was tiny, less than 10% of the economy.
So tiny little states.
That's right.
And so they didn't have lots of kind of regional development officers with their glossy brochures saying, come to Newcastle.
No, it was all done by the private sector. Entrepreneurs did this. It's sort of a very vibrant, bustling sort of place, full of ideas, full of innovation. And of course, now it's just a sort of shade of its former glory.
So what about the mighty northern industry that paid for these wonderful buildings? Well, it can still be seen today, in a museum. The Northeast was one of the world's first industrial powerhouses. High wages drew people from far and wide to work here, like my own ancestors, who came from Ireland.
Welcome to the olden days, Richard.
Yes.
This was the tiger economy of the age, wasn't it? The first tiger economy. We were the first tiger economy.
And I mean, I would say that if we'd had sort of today's levels of high taxes and regulation, it would never have happened.
the difference in standard of living for ordinary people from the beginning of the 19th century to the end of the 19th century. Fantastic change.
Yeah, standards of living over the 19th century improved immensely.
Which is why we see that huge explosion of population.
Yes.
People are just living.
That's right.
Instead of dying and living longer.
Yes, you had more or less universal literacy by 1900 as well, whereas in 1800 it was...
Yeah.
Probably most people were illiterate. So.
With mass production came mass consumption. What were once luxuries enjoyed by the few became affordable and common. You have factory production of clothes. Ordinary people can look rather smart for the first time in history.
Well, yes, I mean, an ordinary person in 1900 would probably, dress in finer clothing than some sort of the aristocrats 200 or 300 years before then. And it wasn't, that long after the 19th century that electricity started to become commonplace, and the huge advances in plumbing and so on, and it just transformed people's living environments.
In the 18th and 19th centuries, Britain was the workshop of the world. We were the first industrial nation. But in the 20th century, Britain became a pioneer of a different kind. We decided to nationalise huge chunks of the economy. Now we led the world in high taxation and big government spending, and places like the Northeast paid the price.
So when did things start to go wrong?
Well, I think it was quite a long process, but I would date sort of the main decline from maybe the First World War and the following decades. That's when we had the huge growth in government.
The First World War cost them an awful lot of money, obviously. They borrowed
Yes.
vast amounts for that.
That's right.
They're taxing heavily to pay for the war and to pay for the interest on what they're borrowing
Yes.
for the war. So could you just explain to me how big government spending affects profits, how it affects commercial enterprise?
Well, it makes entrepreneurship a lot less worthwhile if you don't actually get to keep the profits that you've made. So that's impact on incentives to start with.
So there's no incentive to invest, and also there's less ability to invest because you haven't got the profits to invest.
Exactly, that's right.
As the burden of supporting the expanded state made industry here less and less competitive, rather than responding by cutting taxes, the government raised taxes further still, to fund ever higher levels of government spending. In the space of a few decades, the North was transformed from one of the world's most dynamic industrial regions, a tiger economy, into an industrial has-been. On the Tyne, which was once alive with activity, there is now barely any sign of economic life.
So what do you think?
These sort of big gestures don't really solve anything. To be honest, I'm indifferent to it.
And also the symbolism, I think, is a bit sad. Industrial angel, industry has died and gone to heaven. It's all a bit kind of, oh. So, Arthur, what do you think?
Doesn't represent the North at all.
You don't think that it cheers the region up? Or...
Not one little bit. Most of the local people hate it.
But it's meant to represent industry, I suppose.
Where? Where?
Where's the industry?
Yeah. Tyneside's just dying. It's dying every day. The industry, the shipyards, the steelworks, they're just taking all off us. There's nothing much left for the working man now. All these apprentices and time-served men, skilled men, they're all lost in jobs. It's disgraceful, but, like, nobody in Parliament saying that, like.
Regions where the government is omnipresent, where the government dominates society and the economy and does everything, takes all the decisions, spends all the money, employs everybody. These are very depressing places. The places have been robbed of some of their spirit.
If you think back, in the 1800s, the North East was throwing up people like George and Robert Stevenson, who were huge entrepreneurs. What does it produce these days? If you're an ambitious middle-class person, you want to be a Labour politician.
So they say the sad thing is if they pull the plug on public spending, that all these public sector jobs will go and all these other jobs that rely on that public sector money, they will go. What do you say to that?
Well, obviously there will be a sort of painful adjustment process in the short term where there will be difficult times, but the problem is that these jobs are actually taking jobs out of the private sector because they mean higher taxes have to be enforced on the productive part of the economy.
So they've got to get proper jobs.
Well, yes, they will need to get jobs in the productive part of the economy, yes.
For more than half a century now, countless billions of pounds have been spent in the northeast and other depressed regions. If state spending really did stimulate economic growth, this place should be buzzing. To create new, useful jobs here, we need to revive manufacturing, and this can only be done by shrinking the burden of the state. Public spending must be cut in half. Let's see how it can be done.
Whatever you've eaten throughout the day, chewing Wrigley's Extra helps keep your teeth clean and mouth fresh. Whatever you eat, chew Wrigley's Extra.
I want to make it great. That's Charlie, he's the devil. He likes attacking people whenever he feels like it. What I like about OneNote is I have a little movie I made about Charlie. Copy and then click on OneNote. I think he's enjoying it. Office 2010 helps me make it great.
In Britain today, the public sector is bigger than the private sector. For the real productive economy to thrive, it must be released from the burden of paying for Britain's supersized state. But how?
Now, we're often told we can't possibly cut public spending because it will affect frontline services. Let's see if it's true. Here we have a vessel that represents the public sector. Remember, now we have almost 7.5 million people on the public payroll. How many frontline service workers do we get for our money?
According to the Office of National Statistics, there are now 196,000 policemen and women in the UK, though they complain that much of their time is spent filling in forms. We have 500,000 nurses, though the official figure also includes nurses working in private hospitals. The biggest group is the teachers. We have 962,000 of these, although again the official figure includes teachers working in private schools. There are fewer doctors, only 216,000, again including doctors in private hospitals. And then we come down to much smaller groups, like firemen, of whom we have 57,000, and prison officers, of whom there are 48,000. Add all these frontline workers together and you get just under 2 million. Though remember, this figure has been inflated by including many teachers, nurses and doctors who work in the private sector.
Now, I'm sure there are many worthwhile jobs we haven't included.
But 5.5 million? That's almost twice the number of people who work in manufacturing. What do they all do? The trouble is, it's not always clear from public sector job titles what the jobs involve. We decided to look up some real public sector jobs and then ask a panel of celebrities to guess what they were.
Is it a job involving a product or manufacturing anything?
No.
Do you work with tools?
Yes.
With a hammer?
No.
Stapler?
Yes, I do.
I think I've got it. Are you a community space challenge coordinator?
Yes, I am.
Person-centered planning facilitators and corporate strategy performance advisors, overview and scrutiny managers, and climate change program support officers.
Do you liaise for a living?
Yes.
Do you coordinate?
Yes.
If you didn't do your job, would anybody notice?
Oh, yes. In the private sector, if you really fail and are doing nothing useful, nobody pays you anything, nobody buys your product or service, and you go bust, and that's that. But nobody goes bust in a civil service or a public service like that. They just stay around being futile.
You're not a pigeon fancier, are you? They're not pigeon, birds, in those things you were shaking.
No, no.
Are you connected with the community in some way?
That is part of my job, yes.
If you're a private company and you employ vast numbers of people filling in forms and measuring things for no apparent purpose, you're going to go bust. Because some other private company will be able to produce their product cheaper by not wasting all of that money on bureaucrats and form filling.
Do you counsel other councils about how to counsel councils?
No.
Do you consult other consultants at other councils about how to counsel other consultants at other councils?
Yes.
There is none of the tension of, well, does the guy deliver? Does that woman deliver? Or is she just waddling in, sitting her fat backside on a chair, moving around a bit of paper and going home?
Are you a community management engagement counsellor?
No.
Are you a community engagement counselling manager?
No.
Are you a consultant management engagement community expert counsellor?
No.
Are you a consultation and communities engagement manager? What is that?
When a private company is rubbish, it goes bust. But when a public body is rubbish, it expands. To fix our state education system, for example, politicians have launched a bewildering number of schemes. Early learning partnerships, parenting early intervention pathfinders, learning agreements and excellence hubs, learning outside the classroom, the framework for personal learning and thinking skills, Train to Gain, the Children's Plan, National Skills Academies, Numeracy Task Force, and so on and so on. Each one adds a new layer of bureaucracy, another quango, another set of reports and targets and reviews. Each one merely advertises the failure of the last. So on top of nurses, we have integration governance managers. As well as policemen, we have community safety performance managers. As well as teachers, we have early years inclusion facilitators. We have known ever since the Soviet Union that state monopolies are hopelessly bureaucratic and wasteful, that the goods and services they deliver are rotten and insufficient, that their customers are powerless and treated with disdain. And yet, in Britain, we have state monopolies in key areas, like health and education.
The problem that you have with state providers, especially monopoly providers, if it's a state monopoly, is you deprive the individual citizen of choice. And one of the most powerful things you have if you are buying a product or service is choice. If you don't like this cafeteria, you can go to the one down the road because it's cheaper or nicer. If you don't like that restaurant, go to a different restaurant.
We are used to the idea that government prevents monopolies by private companies. There is legislation against monopolies by private companies.
Because we know that monopolies are a bad idea.
Because the state knows that monopolies are a bad idea. At exactly the same time, it insists on monopolies in education and health.
If you've got a state monopoly provider, you haven't got that choice. You queue up with everybody else and take what you're given and say, Oliver Twist-like, please, sir, can I have some more? And if you don't have that consumer pressure, which you don't with state monopolies at all, then expect bad results.
James Bartholomew has spent the past decade studying Britain's state sector. As he points out, the biggest state monopoly outside communist China is the NHS.
Monopolies tend to do badly, state monopolies tend to do worst of all. We've now become one of the, if not the, worst healthcare system in the advanced world. Worst in pretty well every respect you can think of. We have fewer MRI scanners by far than average. We have fewer beds. We have fewer acute hospital beds. We treat fewer people with fewer cancer drugs and we give them less of them. When they go to their doctor, they don't realise that they're being diagnosed late, that they're being treated late, that they're getting a poor rate of radiotherapy, that they're getting out-of-date cancer drugs. They don't know this. They're innocents, many of whom are dying without knowing it's the fault of the NHS.
I've come to a health tourism show in Olympia. In these days of cheap travel, it's easy to hop on a plane and head abroad for your cancer treatment, say. to a country with much higher cancer survival rates, in hospitals that look more like five-star hotels, and all for little more than the cost of a holiday.
See you again. Bye.
Today we have Saturday, okay, and if a patient is coming here, British patient is coming, I have a serious problem, this and this and this, he can come on Monday and we're going to start immediately.
Does the NHS go to Germany trying to find patients? Do you find many patients wanting to come to England for treatment?
I think Germans would not go to England for treatment, no.
The NHS is the most monopolised state provision in the advanced world, and it is the worst system in the advanced world, the least successful system in terms of treating people well, and indeed treating the poor. So it is the most state-controlled and the worst. There is a connection between these two things.
People say we need a state health system in order to provide healthcare for the poor. Is that true?
In Germany we have a health insured system.
So all Germans must have health insurance?
There's a law that everybody who lives in Germany, not necessarily Germans, but everybody who lives in Germany needs to have health insurance.
What happens if they're poor and they can't afford it?
The state is paying the health insurance. Even if you're poor, unfortunately you get sick, yeah, and then you get the medical treatment, of course, yes.
We don't need to have a nationalised monopoly to treat the poor. They're treated in France, they're treated in Germany, in Italy, all around the world. Advanced countries look after the poor. You don't have to be a state monopoly. You can have an insurance system. That's become the norm in Europe.
The idea that we need state monopolies in order to look after the poor is obviously untrue.
We make sure poor people in Britain have shoes and clothes and food, but we don't have state shoe shops and state clothes shops and government canteens. Can you imagine how awful that would be?
In fact, in our state health and education system, the poor do especially badly.
It's the articulate, pushy middle classes who manage to see the consultant and get their kids into the one decent state school in the area. Excuse me, you've put skimmed milk in my latte. People say you can't possibly privatise health and education because private firms will be in it to make a profit. But we're surrounded by wonderful things made by companies who need to make a profit. Do we say, we can't have a washing machine made by Bosch or Zanussi because they make a profit? Much better to have a washing machine made by the state. Let's not get a Toyota, they're in it for the money. Much wiser to wait in a queue for a government-made Trabant. Suppose I threw a £50 note out of the window every second of every minute of every day. How long would it take me to chuck the UK national debt out of the window? Would it be a year? Would it be 10 years? Would it be 250 years? Well, to chuck the UK national debt out of the window, it would take me more than 3,000 years. In other words, if I had started doing this in 1000 BC, that's before the Trojan War, I still wouldn't have finished. I hope you're picking all these up.
We're in debt because for years government has been spending vast sums of money it didn't have. But we are told that we can't now shrink the state because that would hurt poor people. Supporters of our supersized state like to depict it as a kind of Robin Hood, stealing from rich folk like Andrew Lloyd Webber to feed the poor. This appeals to our sense of fair play, but how accurate is this notion of the Robin Hood state?
Taxes are a colossal burden on virtually everybody in Britain. Taxes aren't for the super-rich, or even just for the affluent. They hit everyone.
The government is spending over 50% of national income this year. You can't tax 50% of total national income just by taxing rich people. There aren't enough of them, and they don't earn enough money.
If you're working on a fairly lowish wage, let's say £8,000, £9,000, £10,000 a year, you are still being clobbered for taxation. Not just in your, taxes you'll pay on your income, but VAT of 20% on everything you buy. When you actually add it all up, the proportion of your money that you've given to the state is vast.
It is the middle class, it's the bulk of the population, and it is the poorest who pay most tax.
It's only when you sit down and add it all up that you realise what high levels of tax people are paying. Someone earning £12,500 a year, that's about the minimum wage. they're paying almost £7,000 in tax. Over half their income is going straight in tax.
Much of Britain's bloated benefits system involves what accountants call tax churning. 1/3 of households in Britain receive more than half their income in the form of state benefits, which have to be paid for out of taxes which are often levied on the very same households.
If you look at very low income people, again minimum wage earners, they're paying as much in tax as they're getting back in benefits. So you're getting this huge churn where the money's flowing around in a great circle with, of course, a lot of bureaucrats to administer it on the way round. And effectively, they're only getting back in benefits what they're paying in taxes.
The Robin Hood state is simply a myth that's used to justify punitive levels of taxation.
The state accounts for more than half of all spending in the UK. And yet the genuinely helpless and vulnerable still lead miserable lives.
The saddest thing is that they haven't accomplished anything with that tax money. They could have taxed us at a fraction of that level and still alleviated poverty, instead of which they wasted on all sorts of nonsense.
In fact, far from alleviating poverty, the state manages to generate more by paying millions of people who are perfectly capable of working to do nothing their whole lives. Nearly 1 in 5 households in Britain is workless.
People want to have some kind of safety net, but Britain has provided one of the worst forms of welfare benefits of any leading country. Other systems around the world are much more demanding. Even in Sweden or Switzerland, after a certain time, for a while you're given generous benefits, but then the window closes and you are expected to get a job. You are expected, regardless of your qualifications, to take any job. I remember it was a scandal in the 1970s when unemployment first breached 1 million. Now we would consider that a major achievement. Permanent mass unemployment has become the norm, and it is the welfare state which has facilitated this.
Last year, the government spent more on welfare than it raised in income tax. Benefits must be reduced to a tiny fraction of current levels. It is madness to pay millions of healthy adults to be permanently idle. Together with a few million public sector workers, they must take jobs in the real productive economy. But where will these proper jobs come from? To find out, I'm heading east. At the edge of the Pearl River Delta, rising out of the South China Sea, the small hilly island of Hong Kong. This is Asia's Manhattan.
Back in the 1950s, Hong Kong was a funny little hangover from the British Empire. Little more than a shanty fishing port, all junks and rickshaws and pointy hats. Colourful, but desperately poor. Well, it's changed.
The city moves at thrilling speed. It's so clean and prosperous. Everyone is so pleasing and alive and busy. The place reeks with confidence and ambition and dynamism. But it didn't used to be this dynamic. Down below the skyscrapers, a taste of old China. This temple is dedicated to the deity Man Xiong, and it tells us a lot about how China used to be. Because before he died and got promoted to God, Man Xiong was a state bureaucrat. He's still worshipped by civil servants. In ancient China, even heaven was bureaucratic.
Two great examples in history of civilizations which were unable to develop, which failed to progress. Ancient Egypt and ancient China, both of them run by vast parasitic bureaucracies. In fact, British senior civil servants still refer to themselves as mandarins, after the state bureaucrats who ran China for centuries.
To see how quickly Hong Kong has transformed itself, I've come to see one of its most famous politicians. Andrew Wong was president of the Legislative Council in Hong Kong when it was handed over to China.
Hong Kong is a name that the British invented. Before the British came, on Hong Kong Island there were some villages. But this is Hong Kong Island, that's Kowloon Peninsula.
And this looks like a kind of shanty town, is it?
It's a shanty town, 1950s, I think. A shanty town, mushroom throughout the whole of Hong Kong. This is Hong Kong Island, early 60s. Hong Kong started big up in the 1960s. I took that ferry boat to school.
The man who is widely credited with transforming Hong Kong was a Scottish civil servant called John Cowperthwaite, who took over as financial secretary here in 1961. Cowperthwaite was an old-fashioned classical liberal. It is said he slept with a copy of Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations by his bed. He believed the best thing government could do was as little as possible.
John Cowperthwaite was a private man, humble, publicity shy. He'd been quite embarrassed at the thought of being cast in bronze. But if there's one person responsible for the economic miracle in Hong Kong, it's him. Why do you have a statue of John Cowperthwaite in your office in Hong Kong?
Because he's my hero. He set the roadmap for us to go and create the last 50 years prosperity in Hong Kong.
Cowperthwaite believed tax was a terrible imposition and an obstacle to growth. So he scrapped lots of taxes and limited income tax to just 15%. Today, still, taxes are low and paid only by the better off. Most people in Hong Kong pay no tax. The effect has been amazing.
By having a lower tax, there's more incentive for the people to make more money and for the economy to become more prosperous.
When you tax people, you're actually punishing success. The higher the tax is, the more punishment you put on success. This is one thing that you don't want to do. If you want people to success, you don't punish them, you don't tax them. This is the basic lesson we learned here.
So how long does it take for them to grow this big?
Jimmy Lai escaped from communist China as a boy and came to Hong Kong with $1 in his pocket. He's now the billionaire founder and head of one of China's biggest media companies.
It's amazing. You know, you feel all the energy all of a sudden. You know, you feel that, there's nothing to stop you. And that's what John Cowperthwaite has given this praise. The aspiration, the hope, and the energy.
John Cowperthwaite is one of my favourite civil servants, probably, in fact, my favourite civil servant of all time.
Cowperthwaite went out there as a civil servant, and his job was to keep Hong Kong under control, but otherwise not to do anything. And he had the good sense not to do anything.
Once the government used to pressure that government should intervene in this and that and that and that and that, then you have a larger and larger public sector and a smaller and a dwindling private sector. And that's the end of the economy. And that's also the end of the civil society too. And I think that's very bad.
Britain was going down the road of a massive welfare state, very high levels of taxation, a very large interventionist government. But instead, Hong Kong chose a completely different path.
And as a result of Hong Kong flourished.
Growth exploded. The economy is growing by very large amounts every single year, year after year after year.
And it grew much faster than Britain did and became richer than Britain per capita in, I think, about 1999 or something. It was big, a big event.
Stars shining bright above.
John Cowperthwaite knew that lower tax meant higher profits, that higher profits meant more growth, and that more growth meant more jobs and higher wages. Before Cowperthwaite, Hong Kongers were about a third as rich as the British. Today, GDP per capita here is a third again higher.
The odd thing is, back in 1960, say, the average Hong Konger would have probably given their right arm for the chance to live in Sunderland. Nowadays, I suspect they'd regard it as a prison sentence.
Birds singing in the sycamore tree.
A small state and low taxes did for Hong Kong exactly what they had done for Britain in the 18th and 19th centuries, and news soon spread across the region. The Asian economic miracle had begun. In Hong Kong in 1961, the Scottish civil servant John Cowperthwaite decided to slash taxes, and the place took off like a rocket. Suddenly, in the 60s and 70s, everything seemed to be made in Hong Kong. And when the factories in Hong Kong could no longer cope, they outsourced work to other parts of Asia. News of Cowperthwaite's miraculous reforms also spread, and soon they were being copied throughout the region with breathtaking results, even in mainland communist China.
The main reason why they could see that this was the right thing to do was they could look at Hong Kong on their doorstep.
The Chinese finally realised that, wait a second, there's something going on in Hong Kong here that we need to imitate. You know, this is a Chinese city, yet it's booming.
If they can succeed so well in a little place like Hong Kong, if the whole of China moves from a socialist economy to a capitalist economy, what might be achieved? And the achievements have been very remarkable indeed.
Instead of busts of Marx and Lenin, the Chinese started producing hundreds of statues of John Cowperthwaite, who was hailed as Asia's man of the century. Cowperthwaite's low-tax revolution then spread to Eastern Europe, which in the 90s was emerging from the nightmare of socialism. A low-flat tax was introduced in countries like Russia and Estonia and Latvia and Lithuania, where growth rates suddenly shot up to as high as 8%, 11%, even 12% a year.
If you cut taxes, you make it easier to produce things, you make it easier to employ people, you encourage a dynamic economy, you sell more products, and you see your economy grow. It's as simple as that, really.
Given that only better-off Hong Kongers pay tax, given there's no VAT, no capital gains tax, no inheritance tax, you might expect there to be terrible services here. And yet, they have a transport system to die for. Platforms you could eat your dinner off. Giant gleaming snaking trains fitted with hundreds of TVs to entertain you. In the International Health and Education League tables, Hong Kong is always near the top, far ahead of the UK. How? Well, strange as it may seem, when tax rates were lowered here, tax revenues actually went up.
If you cut taxes, actually what you see is you've got a dynamic economy which as a percentage terms is taxing people less, but actually yields more in taxation revenue.
If you reduce taxes from very high levels, you can get more economic growth and more tax revenue.
Cutting tax rates actually stimulates economic growth, creates more profits, more jobs, and therefore the Treasury ends up with more tax.
What was once a shanty fishing port is now one of the world's most important commercial centres. This is where the Asian economic miracle began. It's also one of the most exhilarating places on the planet.
All these fast-growing emerging markets are very exciting places. If you just walk down the street in Hong Kong, you smell it in the air, you smell this optimism, this belief that people have that they can actually go out and achieve something, that they can build something.
People can help themselves. If you give them the chance, if you give them more freedom, if you give the market more freedom to create wealth and job and investment, people will have job and help themselves. The lesson for nowadays government to learn is to learn the humility in front of the people. To learn that it's the people who create wealth, given the freedom.
In communist China, the state controls around 28% of the economy. In Britain, the state controls 53% of the economy.
It is almost an iron law of economics, supported by 35 years of statistical research, that the bigger the state, the lower the level and the growth rate of national output.
The last government tested to destruction the idea that more spending was the answer.
The size of the state in Britain is now huge. I mean, more than half of all the wealth created in Britain is expropriated by the state.
The reason that the public sector has grown is because in the last couple of years, because of the recession, because of the financial crisis, it has affected the private sector. Now, I believe that any economy in modern developed economy will be mixed. You can argue exactly who ought to be doing what. I'm not doctrinaire about that.
The public sector spends more than the private sector in Britain, doesn't it?
Well, the public sector is an important part of our economy, of course, yes.
The public sector is bigger than the private sector now, isn't it?
Well, I mean, the two are mutually... The two parts of the economy depend on each other, don't they?
Well, I mean, the public sector certainly depends on the private sector. I mean, it's debatable how much the private sector depends on the public sector.
Well, government procures goods and services from the private sector.
But with the private sector's money, all the wealth comes from the private sector, doesn't it?
Well, the wealth comes from all of us. I mean, again, it depends quite what you define as wealth.
When are we actually going to realise that a growing state sector doesn't work? 55%? 60%? 65%? How much of the economy have our political classes got to control until we say enough?
Well, the era of big government is dead. The government can't expand any further, it can't tax any further, and it has a massive debt to repay.
People have to realise they're their own master. The state has to step aside and allow them to take responsibility for themselves, for their family, and for their children.
I've got £90,000 in my pyjamas.
For all George Osborne's so-called cuts, public spending in 2015 will actually be higher than it was in 2009, and our taxes will have gone up. Present government policy will not work. We must do in Britain what John Cowperthwaite did in Hong Kong. We must chop our bloated state in half. VAT, capital gains and other taxes should be scrapped. The less well-off should pay no tax. The better off should pay no more than 20%. There is no big secret to economic prosperity. All we need is the wisdom and guts to do what's needed.
If material gain, if material solvency, if prosperity is your goal, we know how to get that. And the way to get that is you get as much government off your backs as you can, you get rid of debt as quickly as you can, you encourage savings, you encourage work. There's no mystery to that at all.
History is full of cases where governments have reversed policy and restored economic prosperity very, very rapidly.
I think you'd start to see the results almost immediately, within months, because I have great faith in the dynamism, the brilliance, the creativity of individual men and women in this country.
But it all depends on what is now a clinically obese state getting off the backs of the ordinary working people of this country.
If you want a glimpse of what Britain used to be like in its glory days, don't go to a museum. Take a trip to Hong Kong.
You learned the lessons, as it were, from the British of the 18th and 19th centuries. We can learn that lesson again, you think?
Obviously, because we learn it from the British people.
You have to go back to Adam Smith to start again. Start it all over again. Poor us.
I've got £90,000 in my pyjamas. I've got 40,000 French francs in my fridge. I've got lots of lovely lira now. The Deutschmark's getting dearer, and my dollar bills would buy the Brooklyn Bridge. There is nothing quite as wonderful as money. Money, money, money. There's nothing like a newly minted pound. Money, money, money. Everyone must hanker for the butchness of a banker. It's accountancy that makes the world go round, round, round. You can keep your Marxist ways, but it's only just a phrase. For it's money, money, money makes the world go. Money.